Hello YouTube, and I'm back with another video. Wow, we're really coming thick and fast with the content. And this time it's something a bit different again. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the whole Dragster controversy. For those not aware, wearing a very appropriate top here with my Atari one. The classic Atari game Dragster has been involved in this massive dispute because it had been classified as the longest held video game world record. It was recognized by Twin Galaxies and the Guinness Book of Records. And just this week, it's been tossed out, and the guy behind it, Todd has been banned for cheating. And this is something that it kind of came to light last summer when a speedrunner named OmniGamer did a scientific analysis of the game. Basically, he disassembled the code, worked out how it operated, and came to the conclusion it's actually not possible to achieve the time that was claimed. It was claimed to be 5.51 seconds. And the analysis of the game code said, well, the best you could achieve would be 5.57. Some people saying, well, that's only a small difference. What does it really matter? Well, if you're claiming a record, you're claiming that you've got the longest held video game record. You know, it doesn't matter. On top of that, it's not just that score. It turned like that's kind of set a chain in motion where tons of his scores, and this is Todd now, were being questioned, and quite rightly so, because most of them were just absolutely ludicrous. So you had an example, one example being a game called, I think it was Wabbit. Essentially, he claimed a score in the 600 region. But when gamers started to pick it up today, they found that, well, the game has a kill screen at 1300, and if you're unaware, obviously kill screen means that's where the program fails and you can't proceed by. And when a game has a kill screen, such as Pac-Man or Donkey Kong, that's the end of the game. So even though most people will never see the end of those games because they're just ridiculously difficult to get to the end, if it has a kill screen, that means it has a finite score. And in this case, it had a finite score, but Todd Rogers' score was well beyond that. So how is that possible? So the disputes actually rumbled on for months. And I myself, when I read it, I thought, maybe it's coming from the kind of, I have a computer science background. I don't really understand why this is taking so long to decide. It's very much a cut and pay, or, you know, very defined. The data is very much points to this is a fraudulent score. Maybe a lot of people aren't aware of essentially how video games work, because yeah, they're very visual and great graphics and great artistry, but at the same stage they're basically applications that run on a computer, and a computer is nothing more than a glorified calculator. So when you boil it all down, a video game is nothing more than a series of mathematical equations. And typically you'll find that kind of expressed as things like Boolean algebra. So it'll be if this, then this. So if you can define something in a mathematical term, well, it'd be like trying to say 1 + 1 = 3. That's just not how your equations work. So when you have a good understanding of the code in question, and these games, they're so old, they actually are very simple. If you were to write them down, they'd only be a few pages long. So it's not like trying to analyze, say, a Call of Duty or a Zelda Breath of the Wild, which would be very complex. These are relatively straightforward. And if you do an empirical analysis of it, it will give you pretty much a defined execution of, you know, behavior. And there's no, people talk about the human element. Todd Rogers could have been the human element that made this possible. When you introduce a human into the system, all you're doing is introducing kind of further imperfections. If you have a mathematical model describing how something will occur, that is the upper limit. A human can at best achieve that upper limit, and at worst is just going to fall shy of it. And that's how games work. You may see a lot of speedruns on things like games done quick and those type of things. They're often talking about things like a frame perfect trick. So if you hit on this exact frame, you get this behavior. And that's what something like Dragster boils down to, a series of frame perfect inputs. If you hit all the perfect inputs, you get the best time. No amount of human element is going to do any improvement. You'll just fall away from the best time. And that's where you also hear a lot of confusion over things like tool-assisted speedruns or TASs. A TAS can be beaten, people say. Well, yes, it can, but only when the strategy to achieve it is better understood. So you'll see things like a speedrun of, say, the original Mario Brothers, and the TAS time can be beaten by a human when a newer strategy is uncovered. But in a very, very primitive game where there is no kind of conceivable option for glitches, the game is understood and broken down, the TAS is not going to be improved upon. And it wasn't, or it hasn't been. And that's what people spent months doing. So you had lots of people analysing the code, analysing the kind of the data that OmniGamer produced. A lot of allegations that he was just doing it to try and drum up interest in his book that he was writing. And the funny thing is, in the entire dispute, and the dispute on the Twin Galaxies forum it's over like 300 pages long, and it's on Reddit and all these places. At no point did he bring up his book. In fact, it was other people who accused him, and that's the only mention. That's even how I knew that he was writing a book. But he himself never mentioned it. And he said, when he was questioned about it, he said, the investigation did start out that he was writing a little piece for the book, but it's relatively a small little side note in the whole thing. What really drew his attention to it was the fact that, well, this is the longest held video game world record. Is it really unbeatable? Why is it held for something? Not even that it's Todd Rogers has held it. No one else has come close to it. No one has in 35 years equaled it. Not even beaten it, equaled it. Surely that just doesn't seem right with all of the different opportunities to play it and learn more and get better, but no one even equaled it. That just didn't seem right to him. So that this game became kind of like a lightning conductor for his attention, and he did focus and did analysis, and other people in the industry started looking into what he produced and basically went, oh, we can find no flaws in your analysis. It's correct. Even Ben Heck, Benjamin Heckendorm, from the Ben Heck show, he did a hardware analysis on the stuff he produced and completely validated. He said it was, he could find no flaws. So you got really credible guys basically saying, yep, this is exactly correct. And then on the flip side, you had people saying, well, I've seen Todd Rogers play. I know he's a really good player. He must be I believe him. I believe him. That was what a lot of people were saying. Even the guy who created the game was saying, well, I've seen him play, so I've no doubt that he could do it. And there's a big difference between not having doubt in someone's capability, and I've seen him play, and I would absolutely say he is very, very good. He's great at video games. I could understand why he had the reputation, but being great at something and being a cheater they're not mutually exclusive. You can be both. Only look at sports stars, the amount of them that have taken drugs, or like Michael Schumacher getting disqualified from the 1997 Grand Prix championship. He didn't need, he blatantly cheated and got disqualified. So you can be great at something and still be a cheater. In fact, sometimes the people who cheat are those that are great for whatever reason. Again, you go back to sports, the amount of top athletes that have taken performance-enhancing drugs and eventually got found out. Johnson, was it Johnson in the 86 Olympics set the world record and turned out to be on drugs? So it happens. I mean, Todd's claim was, what benefit would it have been for me to lie? It's like, well, you built a career on your gaming performances. You absolutely would have lied. And he said, well, I was only a teenager. What would I have done? I was like, as if teenagers don't lie? Come on, even just for bragging rights. And if it was one score, you could maybe say it was a misremembrance, it was an oversight. Because sometimes you might genuinely have thought you'd done the score, but 35 years later, it could have been just, it was a 5-7, which is the limit that they believe is possible, instead of a 5-1, one digit wrong. Okay, fair enough. But it's more that there's a whole host of practically impossible scores. So I was actually delighted to see that Twin Galaxies, who had appeared been fairly steadfast in protecting Todd Rogers, They actually went fairly after OmniGamer at one point in the investigation. They were making allegations to a degree that he was only in it for his own interests. So it is kind of refreshing to see that they actually, when they followed the data themselves, and when they heard the other Twin Galaxy referees off the time frame, basically saying, yeah, Todd Rogers was entering in his own scores. He was not necessarily being that honest about it. They said, okay, well, we have to ban him, and we have to delete all. It was nearly 300 records that they deleted, but the most notable being obviously Dragster, given how long it has stood. If it was one, you could say, well, okay, maybe you didn't get it right, but there was dozens in dispute, and some of them are so plain, like the kill screen one I mentioned, but other ones where the score was not in a multiple of what the game awarded points. Well, how could that possibly be? How could you possibly have had that score? Or scores that, without some glitch that was never spoken about, and Todd would never, bring to light, would have taken potentially 80 hours, I think one of them was. It was like, really? You're going to play this game perfectly for 80 hours? That's just and then end in a digit that's not possible? Do you think that's just maybe the Occam's razor comes into play, another computer science thing, I suppose, where the simplest solution is usually the right one, and that's where it's not that all of these crazy circumstances happened for this one guy, it's just that he lied. And certainly if it was me and I was asked to judge, I would say it was fairly clearly demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that he had faked scores. Maybe not all of them. I would actually say that some of his records were legitimate. Some of them that were probably still in the database were legitimate. But you have to make an example. So all of them had to go. When you can clearly define at least one, and several of them are very, very clearly fake, you can't hold any of them in regard as being legitimate. You have to send that message out to other people. And while Todd Rogers is very high profile, there's other communities where they've gone through similar pain, like the Zelda speedrunning community, the GoldenEye speedrunning community. They've had people who have been really top of the kind of tree in terms of putting in great times and great performances, and everyone in the community thinking that they were one of the best. And then it comes out, sometimes years later, actually they were like splicing runs together on their videos to make them look better than they were, or they were manipulating emulators and kind of keying in inputs. They weren't doing live performances. One of them was a Yoshi's Island speedrun that came up quite recently. I seen this guy. He was so audacious in his cheats that not only was he was using an emulator, and he was on Twitch, broadcasting himself. Not only did he have the camera on himself while playing the game, he actually had a camera on his hands on the controller, so you can see the guy pressing the buttons, and you can see the game. That's fairly audacious, because on one hand you would look casually and go, wow, obviously how could he be cheating? He's showing you playing the game. You can see his hands pressing buttons. But on the other hand, when it was actually analysed, the button presses didn't at all match up to what was going on screen in certain key areas. And eventually when pressed about it, he kind of confessed and said, yeah, I held my hand up. In some cases I did use pre-recorded, essentially emulator inputs, and then played them back to make a performance. He said for basically days where, because he streams on Twitch every day, it seemed, for days where he wasn't able to kind of perform at the level he wanted. But at least he owned up to it, and most of the people in those other communities have. I read today that Todd Rogers is still absolutely adamant that his records are all real, and that Twin Galaxies are making a mistake by deleting them, and Guinness are making a mistake by taking off his certificates and stuff. That's like, you're cherry picking the data, mister, there, because he's starting to say, well, I was verified by Activision back in the day. And I was like, were you really? Because you're mentioning that you were verified as having this 5.51 time on Dragster. Fair enough, it did appear in the newsletter. But so did two other people with that exact time, and they actually appeared before you in that newsletter and then mysteriously disappeared. And when they were contacted, they were not phoned by Activision, saying that, oh sorry, we're taking your score away for being cheats. So why were they removed and you weren't? And when you mentioned bringing up a certificate, oh, the Activision certificate, proving your score, I was saying people were making accusations about you submitting fakes that you never did. But this one was actually from Twin Galaxies. They requested, as part of the documentation for the dispute, the kind of certificate that Activision gave for scores back in the day. And he submitted that. But what he submitted to the dispute record was a fake. It was unquestionably a fake, because there was numerous discrepancies in terms of the IDs on it. Each of them have a unique number, and the actual format that was used. So it was quite clearly a fake. He actually had on his own personal website for several years. The website's now gone, but it's still there on the Wayback Machine. He had the fake. So you were using a fake certificate. So you're kind of cherry picking your story points to make it sound like legitimate, but it actually would make me lose even more respect for him, because you've been caught out. There's no point dragging it on when the empirical data points that it wasn't possible. The referees at the time have questioned the legitimacy of multiple scores, highlighted your self-entry scores. At some point you've got to put your hand up and say you were caught out, instead of just kind of hanging on to it. And he also mentioned, or failed to mention, shall I say, that when Twin Galaxies got Ben Heck to do his investigation, they flew Todd Rogers down to Ben to actually sit with him for 2 days to try and recreate his score using his machine. And from Ben's perspective, he said, if the score is possible, my machine can achieve it. All it needs is the input state, and you just tell me which frame to press, it'll do it. 2 days, and he couldn't do it at all, not even close. In fact, his scores were worse than the times produced by OmniGamer's model. And from even just a high-level analysis, you can clearly see, well, if he was so good and he knew the strategy for beating that game, why couldn't he do it? And the strategies weren't even consistent. He talked about starting in second gear, but there's no indication that that's even possible, and he never demonstrated how to do it. So it was all a big mess and a lot of drama. So it's just nice to see that they've actually taken steps to address it, because Twin Galaxies has often been embroiled in kind of, a fairly shady past when it comes to fake scores and potential kind of manipulation of the scoreboards. If anyone's seen King of Kong, they'll probably know all about that. And the company has since changed ownership several times, and there's a guy called Jace Hall running it now. And as I said, I hadn't necessarily thought that they were going to do the right thing. But looking at how they're actually trying to conduct their business, they do appear to be trying to improve their process. They now have more of a peer reviewing kind of on submissions, and they actually allow disputes to be raised, which is very true. I mean, there were scores that were absolutely ludicrously false in the original Twin Galaxies database. You had I know it was Todd Rogers were some of them, 5 million on Donkey Kong and things like that. It's like, well, that's just not possible. All the Donkey Kong expert players know it's not possible. And eventually even Todd, I think, rescinded that one. He said it was a typo. And another famous one was his barnstorming, another Atari one. His time was so good. And remember, apparently, even today, some of the Atari guys are saying, oh yeah, or Activision guys, oh, I believe in his scores. But they won't actually say that they've seen the particular ones in question. I wonder would they stand by things like the barnstorming score, where it was so fast that it got, and this was a few years back, it got people questioning. And when they analysed the code, they said, okay, well, we can't see how we could do it, but what we can do is we can change the ROM and take out the collision for all the objects. And barnstorming basically is you got to fly through a few barns and get to the end of the level. They said, well, what if you take out all the obstacles and just fly to the end of the level, what's the quickest? Because you can't go any quicker than that. And they found that the submission time from Todd was faster than the time where if you didn't do anything in the game but just fly to the end, which you can't do, his time was faster than that minimum time. So it was clearly fake. And this was several years back with another Atari Activision score. Pretty much every one of his Activision scores seemed to be baloney. So to me, it would say, well, actually, Activision are probably in cahoots, because he was part of their PR machine. So they're not necessarily going to have wanted to say, oh yeah, actually he was just a faker and we were just using it as a story. Because of course for the Dragster one back in the day, they were talking about how it was man versus machine. He was able to go faster than the computer simulation was able to do it. I was like, yeah, of course he was able to go faster than the computer simulation. You gave him a fake time. Because after all, they did certify it, and mysteriously the two other certifications for that time disappeared. Strange that. I suspect they just did not want their golden boy, who they did hire, to not have the fastest time on one of their games. And I suppose part of this is coming down from my bias, because the designer in question, David Crane, I've actually met him, and it would very much fall into the whole adage of don't meet your heroes, because as I said, I've got a computer science background, and I would have been from that particular level very intrigued and very much admirer of his work, where you're kind of really kind of coding to the metal. And I remember the first time I went to a Classic Gaming Expo in Las Vegas, I met him there, and I spoke to him. I asked a few questions, and the first question was a very generalized question, and I got an answer, and it was okay. But when I asked him a more technical question, it was about general development. I wasn't going Captain Kirk on him saying, do you remember episode 6 of series 1? And it was more of a general development question. I don't even remember the details of it today. But the answer was very rude and quite abrupt. And it was very clear he just didn't know the answer. And in fact, there was two other Atari guys there, and I hadn't directed a question at them. They were a bit back and sad to say, actually, people weren't talking to them. It was Bob Smith and Steve Waisha. And they chimed in, and they were able to answer from a technical level about the development process, but he was not. It was a bit of an eye-opener. So I suppose I take a lot of what he says now with a big pinch of salt. Again, in this one, it's possibly my personal bias, but and I say don't meet your heroes, because definitely I see him in a very different light today than I did back then. But that's a very much a side story. Either way, it kind of just shows you how back then there was a lot of shady practices. There was a lot of fake scores and whatnot going on. And it also struck me that the culture was really all about bigging up one guy. This is the master player, he's doing, like they called him the king of, he calls himself as well, the king of video games. Such nonsense. I really say that it's so off the 80s, like this greed is good mentality, I'm the best. If you look at the speedrunning community today, it's all about the game. It's really about how far, how much can we push the game. So you will, if you ever watch it again, watch an ADGQ or any of these events, the runners there will all be talking about the game, how to push the game, and then they'll start shouting out all the different players who've contributed to pushing the game further and further and further. It's not about them. Yeah, some of them are actually quite good at putting on a bit of a show and getting a crowd, and they do get a following. But universally, it's all about the community. They always talk about the community and who did what in the community. And there's some players who, even though they're incredibly talented at the execution, they will be different to the people who've actually made it possible. And that's great to see. And I think you see a complete, divergence between the old kind of way the Twin Galaxies used to push individual players like the Billy Mitchells and the Todd Rogers, versus the kind of more speedrunning kind of community where it's all about focusing on the game itself, because that's really what we're all here for, not the individual. Individuals will come and go and scores will always be beaten. Well, so long as they're not impossible.